The metallic bite of the zipper was the loudest sound. In the drafty room, he dragged it up her spine, trapping her in 50 pounds of white silk. "He's not coming," Gideon whispered, his breath warm against her cold neck. "I told you, Beatrice. You were always meant for me." The cathedral antechamber smelled of beeswax, wet stone, and dying gardenias. Beatrice sat rigidly on a velvet stool that was far too small to support the sprawling circumference of her gown. The dress was an architectural monstrosity. It was heavy, stiff, with pearl-encrusted brocade, and designed by an avant-garde Parisian house that insisted on replacing traditional silk buttons with a modern, cold metal zipper down the spine. Right now, it was only half-fastened. The metallic teeth gaped open at her lower back, letting in the damp, freezing draft of the October afternoon. Her maid, Lucy, had stepped out 10 minutes ago. "Just to check the bells, my lady," she had said, her voice high and thin, with an anxiety she was failing to hide. They should have rung by now. They should have. Beatrice looked at the grandfather clock standing like a grim sentinel in the corner. 2:15. She was supposed to walk down the aisle at 2. She didn't feel the panicked flutter of a heartbroken bride. She felt a dull, thudding headache beginning to root behind her left eye. Prince Leopold of Hesse was late. It was entirely in character for him. He was a man who lived his life on a slight delay, always expecting the world to hold its breath until he arrived. But today was not a hunt, or a dinner party, or a night at the opera. Today was a transaction. A massive, publicly scrutinized transaction between her father's shipping empire and Leopold's ancient, penniless bloodline. Beatrice picked at a loose thread on her lace cuff. Her fingernails were buffed clean, devoid of polish, cut sensible and short. She pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her index finger until it stung, grounding herself. The silence in the room was immense, heavy with the distant, muffled sound of rain lashing against the high stained glass windows. Below her feet, she could feel the faint vibrations of the cathedral, 400 guests shifting in the pews, murmuring, coughing, checking their pocket watches. 400 of the most influential people in Europe waiting to see her bought and paid for. Her scalp ached. The hairdresser had twisted her heavy dark hair into a severe chignon, pinning a diamond tiara into the roots with ruthless efficiency. It felt like a cluster of needles digging into her skin. She reached up, intending to loosen just one pin, but stopped. And if she pulled one, the whole structure might collapse. It was a fitting metaphor, though she was too cynical to appreciate the poetry of it. "Where is he?" A drop of sweat rolled down her ribs, catching in the rigid boning of her corset. It was freezing in the room, but the sheer weight of the gown and the creeping dread in her gut made her skin flush. She stood up. The silk hissed against the stone floor, a heavy, dragging sound. She walked to the window. The courtyard below was a sea of black umbrellas. The carriage that had brought her here was still waiting, the horses stamping their hooves impatiently, breath pluming in the gray air. There was no sign of the royal crest, no sign of Leopold's motor car. Beatrice swallowed hard. The back of her throat tasted like stale mint and bile. She wasn't naive. She knew Leopold kept a mistress, a French actress with a penchant for loud jewelry and public shouting matches. It was an accepted part of the arrangement. Beatrice would get the title of princess, her father would get the aristocratic legitimacy he craved, and Leopold would get his debts wiped clean. He could keep the actress. Beatrice had only required one thing of him: punctuality, dignity. A sharp knock at the heavy oak door made her jump. "Finally," Beatrice snapped, her voice cracking slightly. She cleared her throat, smoothing her face into a mask of bored aristocratic irritation. "Come in, Lucy. Fasten this ridiculous dress and let us get this over with." The heavy iron latch clicked. The door creaked inward, pushing a wave of cold air into the stifling room. But it wasn't the small, trembling frame of her maid. A man stood in the doorway, blocking the dim hallway light. He was tall, broad-shouldered and soaked to the bone. Water dripped from the brim of his dark wool hat, pooling on the stone floor. He smelled strongly of rain, ozone, damp wool, and the sharp, medicinal bite of gin. Gideon, the Duke of Whitmore, Leopold's cousin. Beatrice's stomach dropped, hitting the floor with the weight of an anvil. Gideon didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, taking her in, his eyes a pale, washed-out gray that always made Beatrice feel like she was being cross-examined, flicked over the massive expanse of her white dress, the glittering tiara, and finally settled on her face. He didn't look pitying. He looked furious. "What are you doing here?" Beatrice asked. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. She hated it. She lifted her chin, forcing her spine straight, despite the unfastened bodice slipping precariously against her ribs. "You are supposed to be at the altar, standing behind your cousin." Gideon stepped into the room and closed the heavy oak door behind him. The thud was absolute. It severed them from the hallway, from the murmuring crowd above, from the entire world. He reached up and pulled off his wet hat, running a large, ungloved hand through his damp, dark hair. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split an angry red across the joints. Beatrice's eyes caught the blood, but she didn't ask. "Leopold isn't at the altar," Gideon said. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape that filled the quiet room. "I deduced that," Beatrice said sharply. She wrapped her arms around her waist, a defensive posture that only highlighted the awkward, gaping back of her dress. "Is he drunk? If he is, sober him up. I don't care if you have to drag him down the aisle by his collar. My father has already transferred the first installment of the dowry to the royal bank." Gideon let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. He walked toward her, his heavy leather boots leaving muddy scuff marks on the pristine white stone. "He's not drunk, Beatrice." "Then where is he?" Gideon stopped 3 feet away, close enough that the smell of him, gin, tobacco, and something distinctly male and exhausted, overpowered the dying gardenias. "He's on a train," Gideon said flatly. "To Dover. With the actress." Beatrice stared at him. The words didn't make sense. They were English. She understood the vocabulary, but the arrangement of them was absurd. "A train? He boarded an hour ago." Gideon reached into his damp overcoat and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a swallow, and held it out to her. "He took the dowry transfer, drained the account this morning, left a note on my desk saying the pressure of an arranged marriage was suffocating his spirit." Beatrice looked at the flask. She looked at Gideon's bruised knuckles. She realized, with a strange, detached clarity, exactly whose jaw he had split them on. A wave of nausea crashed over her, so violent she swayed on her feet. She didn't faint. She wasn't the fainting sort. Instead, her body reacted with an ugly, visceral rejection. Her nose started to run. Her chest hitched in a dry, painful heave. She snatched the flask from his hand and took a long drag. The gin burned like acid all the way down to her stomach, stinging her throat and forcing a cough out of her lungs. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, completely forgetting her expensive powder and the etiquette drilled into her since birth. "He stole the money," she whispered, the reality finally piercing through the shock. "He stole the money and he left me here." "Yes?" Gideon didn't soften his tone. He didn't offer a platitude. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, though a muscle in his jaw twitched erratically. 400 people are out there," Beatrice said, her voice rising, fracturing into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She gestured wildly toward the ceiling. "The Prime Minister is out there. My father will kill him, and then he will kill me for being a fool." "Your father cares about the optics, not you," Gideon said brutally. "Don't pretend otherwise." "Don't tell me what my father cares about," she snapped, stepping toward him, the heavy silk skirt caught on the heel of her shoe, and she stumbled. Gideon caught her bare arm. His grip was entirely too hard, his fingers hot and calloused against her freezing skin. He held her steady until she found her footing, but he didn't let go immediately. He looked down at where his thumb pressed into her flesh, right beneath the edge of her lace sleeve. "Let go of me," she muttered, pulling her arm back. She felt humiliated, stripped bare. She was standing in a 5,000-pound dress, abandoned, a public punchline in the making. She let out a cracked, ugly laugh. It echoed off the stone walls. "I'm a joke. The merchant's daughter who tried to buy a crown and got robbed instead." "You're not a joke," Gideon said. His voice dropped an octave, losing its harsh edge, becoming something far more dangerous, something intimate. Beatrice shook her head, pacing away from him. The dress felt like a cage. The tight corset was restricting her lungs, making her breaths short and shallow. She felt a sudden, desperate urge to claw her way out of the fabric, to run, to disappear into the rain and never show her face in London's society again. "I need to get out of this," she gasped, reaching awkwardly behind her back. I can't breathe. The back, undo it." She fumbled blindly at her spine. Her fingers scrabbled against the cold metal track of the Parisian zipper, trying to find the pull tab, but it was stuck at her waist, snagged on a fold of silk. She tugged at it frantically, her nails scraping against the fabric, panic rising in her chest. "I'm stuck," she choked out, a genuine note of terror bleeding into her voice. "Gideon, it's stuck. Help me take it off." Gideon didn't move for a long second. The room was perfectly still, save for the frantic rustle of her dress and the ticking of the clock. Then he closed the distance between them. "Turn around," he ordered softly. Beatrice spun around, presenting her back to him. She closed her eyes, letting her arms drop to her sides, her chest heaving against the stiff boning. She expected the immediate relief of the bodice loosening. She expected the cold air to hit her bare spine as he tugged the zipper down. Instead, she felt the heat of his knuckles brush against the sensitive skin at the base of her spine. She shivered violently. Gideon's hands were remarkably steady for a man who smelled of liquor and rain. He didn't pull the zipper down. He found the metal tab, worked it free from the snagged silk with a careful, deliberate pinch, and then slowly, methodically, pulled it up. The metallic teeth gnashed together with a sharp, rhythmic buzz. The bodice tightened instantly, compressing her ribs, sealing her into the dress. "What are you doing?" Beatrice gasped, twisting her head over her shoulder to glare at him. "I said take it off." "No," Gideon said. He caught her shoulder, holding her firmly in place as he continued to drag the zipper upward. The cold metal glided against her warm skin, an agonizingly slow ascent. "Stand still." "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, struggling against his grip. But the dress was too heavy, and he was entirely too strong. "The wedding is off. Leopold is halfway to France. I am not walking out there." "You are walking out there," Gideon said. He reached the top of the zipper, right at the nape of her neck. He paused, his fingers lingering on the delicate clasp. His thumb brushed against the frantic, beating pulse at her throat. "Your father needs a royal alliance. The church is full. The press is outside." "To marry who?" Beatrice laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. "You, the black sheep? The bankrupt duke?" Gideon snapped the final clasp shut at her collar. The click was loud, definitive. "Yes." Beatrice froze. The breath she had been about to take died in her throat. She slowly turned around to face him. He was standing inches away. He hadn't stepped back after finishing the dress. She had to tilt her head up to look into his face. The gray of his eyes wasn't washed out anymore. It was dark, stormy, completely unyielding. "You're insane," she whispered. "I'm pragmatic," Gideon countered, his voice dropping to a raw murmur. "Leopold stole your dowry. Without that money, my estate goes under by Christmas. And without a royal marriage today, your family's stock plummets by tomorrow morning. We are both out of options." "I despise you," she breathed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. It wasn't entirely true, but it was the easiest thing to say. They had spent years circling each other in ballrooms and drawing rooms, exchanging barbed insults while Leopold smiled vacantly beside them. She had always found Gideon too blunt, too rough, too real for the gilded world they inhabited. "I know," Gideon said. He didn't look offended. He looked down at her lips, then back up to her eyes. "But I don't run from my debts, and I don't abandon women at the altar." "This is a mistake," she said, though she could feel the cold, terrifying logic of his words settling into her bones. He was right. It was the only way to salvage the disaster. Gideon reached out. He didn't ask for permission. He brushed a stray, damp curl away from her cheek, his rough, bruised fingers trailing down her jawline. The contrast between his violent knuckles and his gentle touch made a strange, tight knot form in her stomach. "He's not coming," Gideon whispered, leaning in until his breath was warm against her cold neck. He smelled like danger, like salvation. "I told you, Beatrice, you were always meant for me." Beatrice stared at the scuffed lapel of his wet coat. She hated the dress. She hated the situation, but as the cathedral bells finally, belatedly, began to chime above them, a heavy, resounding toll that shook the dust from the rafters, she didn't reach for the zipper again. "You're tracking mud on my train," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Gideon's mouth curved into a slow, devastating smirk. He offered her his arm. "Then we'd better walk fast." The cathedral doors did not open with a grand, sweeping gesture. They groaned, the heavy iron hinges protesting the sudden movement, dragging across the stone floor with a sound like a ship running aground. Beatrice stood at the threshold. The air inside the nave hit her in a suffocating wave, a dense, humid wall of frankincense, burning beeswax, wet wool from 400 damp overcoats, and the sharp, metallic tang of her own terror. The organist, operating on a panicked signal from the choirmaster, struck the opening chord of the processional. It was too loud. The bass notes vibrated in Beatrice's jaw. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at her shoes. White satin, already ruined by a smudge of soot from the antechamber grate. Gideon's hand clamped down over hers where it rested on his forearm. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness. It was a physical anchor, a demand that she keep her knees locked. He stepped forward. The heavy drag of her silk train followed, hissing over the ancient stones. The collective intake of breath from the congregation was a physical thing. It swept through the cavernous space, a rustle of silk and starched collars as heads turned. They expected the golden-haired Prince Leopold. They got the dark, drenched, ruined Duke of Whitmore, his jaw shadowed with stubble, his knuckles split, tracking muddy water down the pristine center aisle. Beatrice forced her eyes up. The aisle stretched out forever, a tunnel of pale, shocked faces. In the front pew, her father, Arthur Harrington, was half standing. His face had modeled into a dangerous, apoplectic shade of plum. His thick fingers gripped the edge of the polished mahogany pew so hard his knuckles were white. He was a man who calculated every variable in his shipping ledgers down to the penny. He had not calculated for this. Gideon didn't flinch. He walked with a heavy, predatory stride, forcing Beatrice to keep up, ignoring the furious whispers erupting like brush fires in their wake. "That's Whitmore. Where is the prince? Is he drunk? Look at her dress, it's dragging in the mud." Beatrice's throat constricted. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to vanish into the heavy brocade of her corset. But Gideon's thumb pressed hard into the tendon of her wrist, sending a sharp spark of pain up her arm. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that didn't carry past her ear. "Look at the altar. Look nowhere else." She looked. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the steps, holding a gold-leafed prayer book. He looked entirely lost. The intricate script of the royal wedding ceremony had suddenly become useless weight in his hands. They reached the steps. Gideon stopped abruptly. Beatrice swayed, the massive skirts of her gown settling around her with a heavy, exhausted sigh. Her father lunged from the front pew, breaking the holy perimeter. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur hissed, spit flying from his lips, his voice trembling with a rage that bordered on violence. "Where is Leopold? Whitmore, you destitute bastard, take your hands off my daughter." Gideon didn't let go. He turned his head slowly. The look he gave Arthur was flat, dead, and terrifyingly calm. "Leopold is on a train to Dover with a French whore," Gideon said. He didn't lower his voice. The front rows of the congregation went perfectly, horribly silent. "He stole your dowry transfer this morning. You are entirely exposed, Arthur. By tomorrow your creditors will know. Arthur flinched as if he had been struck with a cane. The blood drained from his face, leaving the broken capillaries on his cheeks standing out in stark relief. His eyes darted from Gideon to Beatrice, searching for a lie, searching for a way out. This is the only salvageable play, Gideon continued, his tone brutally pragmatic. I have the bloodline. You have the press waiting outside. We proceed. Arthur's mouth opened and closed. The ruthless businessman inside him, the man who had crawled his way up from the London docks to the drawing rooms of Mayfair, was frantically doing the math. A royal duke was lesser than a prince, yes. Whitmore was penniless, yes. But a scandal of a stolen dowry and an abandoned bride would bankrupt the Harrington Company within a week. Arthur gave a sharp, jerky nod, stepping back into his pew. He didn't look at Beatrice. He never really did. Gideon turned back to the altar. The archbishop was staring at them, pale and sweating. Your Grace, the archbishop stammered. The banns were read for... Adjust them, Gideon ordered. The ceremony was a blur of Latin and panicked English. Beatrice didn't hear the vows. She heard the rain hammering the leaded glass above. She felt the painful restriction of the zipper at the nape of her neck, digging into her skin. She felt the damp heat radiating off Gideon's wool coat. The ring, the archbishop whispered desperately. There was no velvet pillow. There was no diamond forged from the royal vault. Gideon reached to his right hand and gripped the heavy, scuffed gold signet ring he always wore. It was ancient, scarred by time and careless brawls, bearing the snarling wolf of the Whitmore crest. He pulled it off. He took Beatrice's left hand. Her fingers were freezing, stiff with tension. Gideon's hands were hot, rough. He didn't slide the ring in with reverence. He pushed it over her knuckle with a firm, definitive shove. It was freezing. It was too heavy. It hung loosely at the base of her finger, a foreign, massive weight. I claim thee, Gideon murmured, ignoring the archbishop's script entirely. His pale, gray eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the crowd, the cathedral, the ruin of the day. Mine. Beatrice stared at the scratched gold against her pale skin. Her chest tightened. A strange, bitter laugh threatened to tear its way out of her throat. She had bought a crown, and she had received a snarling wolf instead. The carriage door slammed shut with a concussive thud, cutting off the flash of the press cameras and the chaotic shouts of the reporters gathered in the rain. The silence inside the cabin was sudden and oppressive. The carriage was built for two, but the voluminous skirts of Beatrice's Parisian gown consumed the velvet seating, forcing Gideon into the opposite corner. The space smelled violently of damp leather, Gideon's gin, and the crushing, dying scent of Beatrice's crushed gardenia bouquet, which lay discarded on the floorboards between his muddy boots. The carriage jolted forward. Beatrice's head snapped back against the tufted velvet. The adrenaline that had carried her down the aisle, past her father's fury, and through the barrage of flashbulbs, evaporated instantly. In its place came a crushing, hollow exhaustion. Her bones felt like lead. Her scalp throbbed a vicious, rhythmic pulse. She reached up with shaking hands and buried her fingers into her heavily pinned hair. She found the base of the diamond tiara and yanked. Careful, Gideon said from the shadows of his corner. Shut up, Beatrice snapped, her voice cracking. She pulled harder. Hairpins tore free, bringing small, sharp clumps of hair with them. The tiara came loose with a violent scrape against her scalp. She didn't care. She threw the priceless artifact onto the opposite seat. It bounced off the velvet and landed in the folds of her dress. Heavy, dark sections of her hair tumbled down her back in a messy, ruined cascade. She pressed the heels of her hands to her eyes. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. She was too angry, too humiliated. Her chest heaved against the rigid, unyielding cage of her bodice. The zipper he had forced up her spine felt like a rod of iron, keeping her trapped. You're bleeding, Gideon noted casually. Beatrice dropped her hands. She looked at him. He was slouched into the corner, one long leg stretched out, encroaching on the sea of her white silk. He was watching her with that infuriating, steady gaze. She reached up and touched the side of her head. Her fingers came away with a smear of bright red blood where a hairpin had gouged her scalp. She wiped it on the thigh of her pristine silk gown, a bright, ugly red streak against the white. "It matches the mud you tracked onto my train," she said coldly. Gideon didn't smile, but the corner of his eye tightened. He reached into his damp coat, produced the silver flask, and unscrewed it. He held it out across the small space. Beatrice stared at it. She was the Duchess of Whitmore now, a title wrapped in scandal and impending poverty. She snatched the flask from his hand. She didn't sip. She threw her head back and swallowed a burning gulp of the cheap gin. She coughed, the liquor searing her throat, and handed it back. "My father will have his lawyers look into the dowry by nightfall," Beatrice said, her voice raspy from the gin. "He'll try to trace Leopold." "Let him try," Gideon said, taking a drink himself. He rested his head against the glass window. The rain outside blurred the gaslights of London into yellow smears. "Leopold is a coward, but he knows how to hide. The money is gone, Beatrice." "And your estate?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, the heavy signet ring sliding down to her knuckle. "Is it as ruined as the rumors say?" "Worse," Gideon replied, brutally honest. "The roof in the West Wing collapsed in February. The servants haven't been paid in 2 months. I have enough coal to last until November. After that, we freeze." Beatrice let out a harsh breath, shaking her head. The sheer absurdity of it all was beginning to suffocate her. A magnificent transaction. I traded my family's fortune to become the mistress of a crumbling ruin. "You traded your family's fortune to avoid becoming the laughingstock of Europe," Gideon corrected softly. "I merely provided the shield." "Don't act like a martyr," she snapped, glaring at him. "You needed me. You needed the Harrington name to placate your creditors for another month. You saw an opportunity to save your own miserable skin, and you took it." Gideon's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere in the carriage shifted. The air grew thicker, heavier. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until his knees brushed against the massive wall of her skirts. "I took what belonged to me," he said. His voice was no longer a gravelly drawl. It was sharp, vibrating with a sudden, dark intensity. "Leopold didn't want you. He wanted your father's bank accounts. He looked at you and saw a ledger." "And what do you see?" she challenged, her chin lifting. "A bank account attached to a ruined reputation." Gideon looked at her. He looked at the smear of blood on her cheek, the ruined hair framing her pale, exhausted face, the rigid, unnatural posture forced upon her by the heavy silk and iron boning. He reached across the carriage. Beatrice stiffened, preparing to pull away, but he didn't grab her arm this time. He took her left hand, the one bearing his enormous scratched ring. He turned her hand over, his calloused thumb tracing the pale, smooth skin of her inner wrist. The contrast between them was stark. Her skin was perfectly manicured, soft, untouched by anything harsher than a silk glove. His hands were battered, stained with ink and tobacco, the knuckles split open and weeping clear fluid from where he had shattered his cousin's jaw. "I see a woman sitting in a cage she built for herself," Gideon murmured, his thumb pressing into her erratic pulse. "And I see the only person in London who doesn't bore me to death." Beatrice couldn't breathe. The carriage was suddenly entirely too small. The smell of him, rain, gin, and that dark, earthy heat was overwhelming. She wanted to pull her hand away, she wanted to slap him, but the warmth of his fingers against her freezing skin was the only real thing in a day built entirely of lies. She didn't pull away. She let him hold her hand as the carriage rattled over the cobblestones, leaving the glittering lights of Mayfair behind, plunging into the dark, wet roads that led out of the city. Whitmore Manor did not loom. It sagged. When the carriage finally pulled to a halt, the rain had settled into a miserable, freezing drizzle. Beatrice stood in the gravel driveway, the hem of her avant-garde Parisian gown soaking up the muddy water like a sponge. The manor before her was a hulking mass of darkened stone. Half the windows were boarded up. The ivy crawling up the brickwork looked dead, skeletal vines gripping the crumbling masonry. There were no footmen. There was no welcoming committee. Gideon pushed open the heavy front door with his shoulder, the wood groaning loudly in the silent night. He walked inside, striking a match against the stone wall to light a single, flickering gas sconce in the entryway. The smell of the place hit Beatrice instantly. Old ash, damp wood, stale dust, and a deep, pervasive cold. It felt like a tomb. "Watch your step," Gideon said, turning back to her. "The third stair is rotten." Beatrice gathered the heavy, muddy folds of her skirt in both hands and stepped over the threshold. Her wet satin shoes squelched against the warped floorboards. She looked around the cavernous foyer. The shadows stretched high into the vaulted ceiling. A grand chandelier hung above them, draped in thick, gray cobwebs, missing half its crystal drops. "Where are your staff?" she asked, her voice echoing too loudly in the empty space. "The cook is deaf and asleep in the basement," Gideon replied, shrugging off his heavy, soaked overcoat and throwing it over a dusty chair. "The housekeeper leaves at 5. As I said, they haven't been paid. I don't demand overtime." He walked toward a massive, curved staircase. He didn't offer his arm. He expected her to follow. Beatrice gritted her teeth. She hauled the 50 pounds of wet silk up the stairs, avoiding the third step as instructed. Her legs were trembling with exhaustion. The headache behind her eye had blossomed into a blinding migraine. Every movement pulled at the tight, unyielding bodice, restricting her oxygen. Gideon pushed open a door at the end of a long, drafty hallway. He walked in and struck another match, lighting a kerosene lamp on a bedside table. Beatrice stepped into the doorway and stopped. The bedroom was massive but hopelessly bare. A large four-poster bed dominated the center. The heavy velvet curtains faded and moth-eaten. There was a stone fireplace, cold and empty. A single cracked mirror stood in the corner. There was no maid. There was no fire. There was just the cold, the shadows, and Gideon. He stood by the bed, unbuttoning his damp waistcoat. He pulled it off and tossed it onto a trunk. His white shirt was rumpled, open at the collar, revealing the dark hair on his chest and a faint, silver scar curving across his collarbone. He looked up, catching her staring from the doorway. "Come in, Beatrice," he said. His voice was quiet, lacking the mocking edge it usually held. "You're shivering." She was. The cold of the house had seeped through the wet silk, chilling her to the bone. She stepped into the room, letting the heavy door click shut behind her. She dropped her muddy skirts. They pooled around her, a ruined, filthy mountain of fabric. "I need Lucy," she said, her voice thin. She wrapped her arms around her waist. "I need my maid. I can't get out of this dress." "Lucy is in London," Gideon said gently. He walked toward her. "I'll do it." Panic, sudden and sharp, flared in Beatrice's chest. "No." She took a step back, her heel catching on the heavy train. "You don't know how. The zipper." "I know how the zipper works, Beatrice," Gideon said. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her. "I'm the one who trapped you in it, remember?" She looked up at him. The fight drained out of her, leaving nothing but raw, aching vulnerability. She was exhausted. She just wanted the crushing weight off her chest. She turned around, presenting her back to him. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the erratic, shallow sound of her own breathing. She felt Gideon step closer. The heat of his body radiated against her freezing skin. His rough, battered fingers brushed the nape of her neck. She squeezed her eyes shut. He found the metal clasp. The sharp click of it opening echoed in the quiet room. Then he found the pull tab of the zipper. He didn't yank it. He pulled it down slowly, methodically. The metallic teeth parted with a slow, grinding buzz. The sound was incredibly loud in the silence. With every inch the zipper descended, the agonizing pressure on her ribs released. Cold air rushed against her heated, damp spine. He pulled it past her shoulder blades, past the curve of her waist, down to the base of her spine. "Hold your arms up," he murmured, his voice rough. She raised her arms. Gideon gripped the heavy, stiff fabric of the bodice and pulled it downward. The dress peeled away from her skin like a husk. The sheer weight of the gown dragged it down, falling to the floor around her ankles with a heavy, wet shhh. Beatrice stood in the center of the muddy silk ring, wearing nothing but a thin, sweat-dampened cotton chemise and her ruined satin shoes. She felt stripped, exposed. The chemise clung to her skin, sheer in the dim kerosene light. She crossed her arms over her chest instinctively, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Gideon stepped around the pile of silk to face her. His eyes dropped. He didn't look at her with the polite, bored gaze of a gentleman. He looked at her with the sharp, unblinking focus of a starving man. He looked at the red, angry welts the corset boning had pressed into her pale skin. He looked at the erratic, rapid rise and fall of her chest beneath the thin cotton. Beatrice's breath caught. She expected to feel shame. She expected to feel fear. Instead, a strange, dark heat uncoiled low in her stomach. Leopold had never looked at her like this. Leopold had looked at her clothes, her jewelry, her father's carriage. Gideon was looking at her, the bruised, exhausted, imperfect reality of her. Gideon raised his hand. His knuckles were still weeping, the skin torn and brutal. He reached out and brushed the back of his fingers against the angry, red line on her ribs where the corset had dug in. His touch was impossibly light, a stark contrast to his massive hands. Beatrice gasped, a tiny fractured sound. Her skin burned where he touched her. "I told you at the altar," Gideon whispered, his eyes slowly dragging up from her ribs to meet her wide, dark gaze. The stormy gray of his irises was completely black in the dim light. He stepped into the pile of silk, closing the final inch between them. His hands moved to her hips, hot and heavy, pulling her flush against his solid, unyielding frame. "You're mine now," he breathed, his mouth hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. He smelled of rain and ruin and absolute certainty. "And I don't intend to let this marriage be in name only." Beatrice didn't step back. She tilted her chin up, the heavy, cold metal of his signet ring pressing into his shoulder as she reached for him. "Then, prove it," she whispered back, and Gideon closed the distance. Beatrice traded a deceitful prince for a ruined duke, but the heat in that drafty manner is undeniable. What did you think of Gideon stepping up to claim her, and the intense reality of their wedding night? If you love historical romances that ditch the fairy tale for raw, gritty emotion, smash that like button. Share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. Are you Team Leopold or Team Gideon? See you in the next video.